You may know Heraclitus only for a quote, "No man ever steps in the same river twice." A simple observation perhaps, but in the world of ancient Ionia, around 500 BCE, it was a radical thought. Change, he believed, was the only constant. But for someone who taught the inevitability of change, Heraclitus's own death, quiet, slow, strange, would be a cruel contradiction of that principle. Heraclitus was born in the city of Ephesus, a bustling port town on the Aegean Sea in what is now modern-day Turkey. It was a city of traders, temples, and politics, a place where golden ideas flowed alike, though not always in equal measure. He came from aristocracy, but he rejected it. He was known to have voluntarily given up his right to rule, choosing instead the life of a solitary philosopher. Unlike the brooding intellectuals you might picture today, Heraclitus lived alone, walked alone, and thought far ahead of his time. He criticized Homer. He criticized Pythagoras. He even criticized the Ephesians themselves. He called them fools, preferring to walk the mountains alone and meditate rather than engage in public life. "Much learning does not teach understanding," he wrote, which was his way of saying knowledge is not the same as wisdom. In his later years, Heraclitus grew increasingly reclusive. Ancient reports claim that he turned to living in the wilderness, surviving on herbs and roots, developing a condition called dropsy, what we would now call edema. His body began to swell with fluid. It was a slow, uncomfortable condition that reflected the decay of the body from within. A strangely appropriate fate for a man obsessed with the tension of opposites, fire and water, movement and stillness, growth and decay. As his condition worsened, Heraclitus did something rather odd. He returned to the city, reluctantly, and approached the local doctors, not with a plea for help, but with a riddle. He asked them, "Can you make a drought out of a deluge?" The doctors, baffled by his metaphorical speech, didn't know how to answer. He offered no further clarification, and so, receiving no help, he retreated once more. What happens next is one of those moments that feels less like history and more like some half-remembered myth. Heraclitus, swollen with fluid, aching, alone, made a decision. He buried himself in dung. Yes, actual manure. The ancient sources claim that he believed the warmth of cow dung would draw the moisture from his body, curing him. It sounds absurd today, but warm compost was, in ancient healing practices, thought to have medicinal value. Steam baths and mud were used for inflammation, and in his desperation, Heraclitus resorted to one of the oldest, strangest remedies known to man. He lay there for days, covered in dung, sweating in the summer sun. One can imagine the scene. An old frail man with a once great mind hidden away in filth, trying to rebalance the elements inside his body, drying out water with heat and earth. Perhaps he thought of balance, of fire, overcoming water, of nature undoing what nature had inflicted. But the body has limits, and no philosophy, no matter how poetic, could change that. By the time someone found him, likely too late, he was delirious and near death. He eventually perished, most likely from infection or organ failure. His final attempt at self-healing had failed, and with it, the strange flickering light of a mind so far ahead of its time quietly went out. Yet Heraclitus's ideas lived on. His notion that the world is in constant flux shaped later thinkers like Plato and the Stoics. He taught that fire was the basic element of all things, not water as Thales believed, nor air as Anaximenes insisted. Fire was change. Fire was life. And fire, in the end, is what consumed his memory. No tomb, no shrine, just a name passed down through centuries of philosophers, all of whom wrestled with the question, what does it mean to change? And perhaps the more pressing question, why would a man so obsessed with fire choose to die covered in mud? Heraclitus of Ephesus was never a man of ease, and neither was his thinking. His death in a pile of dung might sound like a strange footnote in the history of ideas, but to truly understand it, to feel the weight of what led him there, you have to look deeper. Beyond the shock of the end lies the long solitude that made it inevitable. You see, Heraclitus was not merely eccentric, he was radical. While the philosophers around him spoke in certainties, he spoke in riddles. Where others wrote systematic treatises, he offered only fragments, brief cryptic lines that confused as much as they enlightened. One reads them like whispers from a mind caught mid-thought. The path up and down are one and the same. War is the father of all things. You cannot discover the limits of the soul even if you travel every road to do so. These are not aphorisms for casual thought. They demand your attention. They frustrate your logic. They force you to sit with contradiction. In Ephesus, this made him less a local treasure and more a tolerated oddity. His writings, if you could even call them that, weren't laid out as arguments or lectures. They were collected in a scroll that was eventually stored in the great temple of Artemis. Some say he did this as a symbolic gesture, to place his work among the gods or perhaps away from people. His tone, always severe, carried the weight of disdain for common minds. To Heraclitus, most people were sleepwalkers. They are at odds with the Logos, he said. Logos, a concept so central to his philosophy, yet almost impossible to define precisely. Not just word or reason, as later translators tried to pin it down, but a kind of universal order, a balance, a rhythm, an intelligence beneath all things. To live without awareness of Logos, he believed, was to live as cattle do, reacting, consuming, dying. No wonder then that he withdrew more and more from public life. If the city would not understand him, he would not waste breath explaining. But such solitude has consequences. Heraclitus was not just intellectually alone. As he aged, he seems to have become physically isolated as well. Ancient sources suggest he lived in the countryside, cut off from friends, family, and former colleagues. His body aged with no one to observe the slow accumulation of illness. Edema doesn't come on suddenly. It builds. Swelling limbs, fatigue, skin that leaves indentations when pressed. We don't know how long he suffered before he walked back into Ephesus with his infamous riddle about droughts and deluges. But it was probably too long. And when the doctors dismissed him, failing to pass his poetic metaphor, it wasn't just a medical failure, it was the final break in Heraclitus's already thin connection to his society. Still, there's something haunting about his final attempt at healing. The dung treatment, as strange as it sounds to modern ears, wasn't an invention of madness. In the 5th century BCE, the line between medicine and philosophy was blurrier than we imagine. Warmth, balance, humors, these were not just ideas but frameworks for survival. If a body was full of water, perhaps heat could pull it out. If a man could understand the order of nature, perhaps he could command it. In laying down in manure, Heraclitus may have thought he was aligning himself with the very fire he so revered. Compost generates heat naturally, especially in large piles. In his mind, he might have imagined himself drawing the water out, reversing the imbalance, restoring harmony. And yet, in trying to become one with the elements, he succumbed to their indifference. What was going through his mind in those final hours? Did he regret the rejection of his civic duties? Did he still believe he was right, that Logos was real even as his own body failed him? We cannot know, but what is clear is this: Heraclitus, unlike many other thinkers of his time, saw death not as an end but as a transformation, a reconfiguration of opposites, a return to the eternal flux. He believed that even the soul had its own rhythm, a fire, he said, kindled by the beating of the heart. For souls, it is death to become water, he wrote. For water, it is death to become earth. But from earth comes water, and from water soul. In other words, everything rises and falls in a cycle. If so, perhaps Heraclitus did not fear death. Perhaps he viewed it as the next logical phase of being, a change of state, from man to element, from thought to memory. Still, there's a quiet contradiction worth noting. For someone who spoke of change as the essence of life, Heraclitus seemed unable to change his own fate. He clung to isolation, to riddles, to contempt for the common man. And in doing so, he may have sealed a fate more tragic than any public execution or dramatic fall from grace. He died in silence, mostly forgotten by the people of his time. Only much later, centuries later, did other philosophers pick up his fragments and start to see the depth within them. the Stoics, the Neoplatonists, and even early Christian thinkers would all echo aspects of his ideas. Logos especially would take on powerful new meanings, but during his life, he was largely alone, a fire burning too far from the village to warm anyone. So perhaps the real question isn't why he died as he did. The question is, how many Heraclituses have the world ignored simply because they spoke too soon? There are no surviving portraits of Heraclitus from his lifetime. No busts carved in his image while he was alive, no amphorae with his likeness. Only much later did artists, centuries removed, imagine his face, often scowling, eyes shadowed, hair wild. In medieval manuscripts he was the weeping philosopher, a foil to Democritus, the laughing philosopher. The image stuck, not because it was accurate, but because it felt true. Heraclitus wept not out of sadness, perhaps, but out of clarity. He saw too much, saw the foolishness of his fellow citizens, the contradictions in the world, the certainty with which people clung to false beliefs. In an age of oracles, he pointed to patterns. In a world of gods, he spoke of fire. He died, yes, wrapped in dung and dismissed by doctors, but the tragedy is not merely physical. The tragedy is that Heraclitus spent his life trying to communicate a reality that no one else was ready to hear. In the years after his death, his fragments slowly made their way through time. Scholars and philosophers, translators and scribes collected what they could. Some say he wrote a single book titled On Nature and deposited it in the Temple of Artemis. Others say his sayings were scattered, written on papyrus, or scratched into tablets, eventually crumbling with age. Regardless, only about 120 fragments remain, tiny shards of a large, intricate mirror, now mostly lost to time. Yet even those fragments echo. Centuries later, the Stoics built entire philosophies around the concept of logos. They softened Heraclitus's fire, made it something divine. They imagined the universe as ordered by a rational structure, an idea that would travel through Roman emperors, medieval theology, and even Enlightenment science. Christian thinkers, too, were drawn to the word. In the Gospel of John, the opening lines read, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God." The term used in Greek, logos. It's doubtful the Gospel author meant it in Heraclitus's sense, but the coincidence, or perhaps the quiet influence, is hard to ignore. What began as a cryptic fragment from a lone philosopher in Ephesus now forms the backbone of the Western religious and intellectual tradition. His idea of constant change, too, would ripple forward. In biology, we speak of evolution. In physics, of entropy. In economics, of market cycles. All acknowledge what Heraclitus tried to express so long ago. Nothing stays the same. Not the river, not the soul, not the world. And yet, one must ask, what did all this mean to Heraclitus in his final moments? Did he know that his thoughts would survive him? That his words would shape the minds of emperors and saints? Or did he believe, as he lay dying in a strange and solitary ritual, that he had failed? We'll never know. But perhaps Heraclitus himself would say that the question doesn't matter, that the end of a life is not the end of its fire. The fire transforms, moves, changes shape, from heat to smoke, from smoke to air, from word to memory. And memory, too, is never the same river twice. In the modern world, Heraclitus is rarely read in full. Most know him from passing quotes on posters or self-help books. His image has been distilled, like so many ancient thinkers, into sound bites. But if you pause, if you sit with his fragments in the quiet, you start to see the depth. This was a man who saw opposites not as contradictions but as companions, who believed that harmony was born from tension, that death and life were not enemies but transitions, that even something as absurd as dying in a compost heap could carry meaning if the meaning was sought. So what are we left with? Not a moral exactly. Heraclitus would scoff at morals, but perhaps a reflection that sometimes the most profound minds are the ones that speak in ways we aren't ready to hear. That wisdom is not always loud or neat or popular. Sometimes it's hidden in the hills, or muttered in riddles, or left behind in the corner of a forgotten temple. And in a world constantly in motion, perhaps the only thing we can do is listen. Carefully, quietly, knowing that the fire still flickers, even long after the man has gone. Rome had known emperors who seduced the Senate, and emperors who strangled it. It had known tyrants, generals, visionaries, and madmen, but it had never seen one quite like Claudius. When he came to power in 41 CE, Claudius was nearly 50 years old. Lame, stuttering, awkward, and widely mocked as a fool, he had spent most of his life in the shadows of palaces, tolerated but never taken seriously. His own mother once called him a monster. His family hid him away during public ceremonies, fearful his physical impairments would embarrass their noble lineage. And yet, in a twist both ironic and utterly Roman, it was precisely that perceived weakness that saved him. In 41 CE, Emperor Caligula, young, unstable, and increasingly unhinged, was assassinated in a chaotic coup. While the Praetorian Guard ransacked the palace, they stumbled upon Claudius hiding behind a curtain, not plotting, not posturing, hiding. He reportedly begged for his life. Instead, they proclaimed him emperor. Some say it was a joke. Others say it was desperation. But whether by chance or by design, Claudius, uncertain, scholarly, underestimated Claudius, found himself ruling the greatest empire in the world, and he did not waste the opportunity. Claudius surprised everyone. He brought order where there had been chaos. He reined in the corruption of the Praetorian Guard. He expanded Rome's civil service and completed massive public works, roads, aqueducts, canals. He even led the successful conquest of Britain, something even Julius Caesar had failed to accomplish, permanently. He was by many measures a competent and even visionary ruler, but his court was another matter. Inside the marble halls of the imperial palace, Claudius remained isolated. He trusted freedmen, former slaves, more than senators, and his court became a battleground of petty intrigue and whispered betrayal. Most of all, he trusted the wrong women. His fourth wife, Agrippina the Younger, was clever, ambitious, and utterly ruthless. She was also his niece, a fact that scandalized many but not enough to stop the marriage. Claudius adopted her son Nero as his heir, pushing aside his own biological son Britannicus. Some say he knew what she was doing. Others believe he was blind to her manipulation. Either way, within a few years, Agrippina had clawed her way to the top of Roman power, and it's here in the later years of Claudius's reign that the whispers of death began to swirl. By the year 54 CE, Claudius was showing signs of age. Slower speech, weakened steps, and most dangerously, second thoughts. There were rumors, quiet ones, that he was planning to remove Nero from the line of succession, to replace him with Britannicus, who was finally coming of age. Agrippina, always listening, would have known this. And she, more than anyone, understood that time was no longer on her side. Then came the fateful banquet. Ancient sources differ on the details, but the general outline is clear. A lavish dinner, laughter, toasts, an imperial mushroom dish, said to be one of Claudius's favorites. He consumed it gladly, and then silence. According to the Roman historian Suetonius, Claudius was struck suddenly ill that evening. Some say he vomited violently. Others claim he merely slipped into a stupor. Still others suggest that Agrippina, realizing the first dose of poison hadn't worked, called in his physician, a man loyal to her, to finish the job with a poisoned enema or feather. Gruesome, but not uncommon in Roman poisonings, which often required multiple attempts. By morning, the emperor was dead. The news was not announced immediately. Agrippina reportedly stalled for hours, perhaps even days, delaying the public revelation, while securing her son's position. When the death was finally declared, Nero was already in place, named emperor, hailed by the guard, and proclaimed by the Senate. Claudius, once the fool who became a ruler, was quietly swept into history. But what do we make of his end? Was it a clean assassination, perfectly timed and politically necessary? Or did he simply die of natural causes, with the myth of murder added later by hostile sources. Even in death, Claudius remains obscured by rumor, by contempt, and by the slippery nature of imperial Roman history. And yet even the image remains. The emperor who brought order to Rome, brought Britain to its knees, and was perhaps brought down by a mushroom and a mother's ambition. One can't help but wonder, was Claudius aware of what was coming? Did he taste it in that final bite? The Roman Empire did not kill its emperors cleanly. It did so in whispers, in glances exchanged across candlelit banquets, in quiet nods between freedmen, in notes passed from physician to chamberlain. Claudius, so often underestimated, may have understood this more than we think. In the days leading up to his death, Claudius had grown cautious. According to Tacitus, he had begun to regret his marriage to Agrippina. The cold ambition in her eyes no longer amused him. Her growing influence troubled him, and worse still, Nero's rise had turned from political strategy into something more dangerous, a threat to the bloodline Claudius himself had built. Britannicus, Claudius's son with his third wife Messalina, had been sidelined for years. Agrippina had ensured it, but now with the boy entering adolescence, Claudius reportedly began to consider reinstating him. Perhaps he planned to announce this at a public ceremony. Perhaps he only murmured it in private chambers. Regardless, Agrippina likely heard of it. In Rome, secrets moved faster than footsteps, and so the last evening came. The banquet was not unusual. Lavish dinners were routine in the imperial household. There were entertainers, foreign dignitaries, senators eager to please. Claudius, who had never been at ease with crowds, likely kept to his corner, listening more than speaking, chewing more than scheming. But the mushrooms. The mushrooms were different. According to some sources, Agrippina arranged for the imperial taster to be absent that evening. In his place, a trusted servant. The dish arrived as usual. Claudius, fond of mushrooms, the food of the gods, he reportedly called them, ate without hesitation. The poison would not have been immediate. Roman poisoners were strategic. Death needed to look natural. Illness must appear to precede it. The mushroom, likely laced with Amanita phalloides, the death cap fungus, would have taken hours to manifest its damage. Nausea, confusion, tremors. The liver and kidneys would begin to fail slowly and painfully. Suetonius writes that Claudius collapsed that night. His wife was summoned. Physicians were brought in. But curiously, rather than rushing to save him, those around him seemed prepared, almost rehearsed. One account claims Agrippina prevented Seneca, Nero's tutor, from leaving the palace that night, perhaps to ensure his silence, perhaps to secure his support in the morning. She reportedly called for Locusta, a professional poisoner long associated with the imperial court, to ensure that Claudius's death was complete. Another detail, repeated in multiple sources, speaks of a poisoned feather. Used to induce vomiting, the feather was tipped with a second dose, just in case the mushrooms alone had not been enough. It was administered by Claudius's own doctor, Xenophon. Imagine that moment. An aging emperor, dazed and writhing, eyes fluttering open to find his trusted physician standing over him. A feather sliding down his throat, and the warmth of poison again. Whether he understood what was happening is impossible to know. But Claudius was not the fool history often paints him to be. He had survived the madness of Caligula, the ambition of Messalina, the contempt of the Senate. He had studied deeply, written histories, played the game of power with subtlety. He may have known. In those final moments, he may have understood the silence in the room, the absence of Britannicus, the stillness of Agrippina's gaze. Perhaps he even expected it, because in Rome, dying in your sleep was rare. Dying of old age, rarer still. For emperors, death was political theatre, and Agrippina, she played her part to perfection. By dawn, Claudius's body had not yet grown cold, but the machinery of succession had already begun. Nero was brought forth to the Praetorian Guard. Claudius's death was announced with solemn formality. No mention of mushrooms, no whisper of treachery. Just the end of a reign and the beginning of another. And Britannicus? He was reportedly told to remain in his chambers. He would never become emperor. Nero, 15 years old and already coached in cruelty, stepped into the purple robes with astonishing ease. But Rome never forgets. Not entirely. Years later, when Nero himself began to unravel under the weight of paranoia, cruelty, and artistic delusion, the memory of Claudius came back to haunt him. He would go on to poison Britannicus, just as his mother had allegedly poisoned. Claudius, a cycle completed, a mirror cracked. And yet, Claudius, in death, proved more enduring than Nero in life. His works, once mocked, were later studied. His policies, especially those concerning Roman law and provincial governance, endured far beyond his reign. The aqueducts he completed still carried water. The canal projects he funded reshaped landscapes. His conquest of Britain, though blood-soaked, laid the foundation for centuries of Roman rule on that island. Perhaps Claudius understood something. His killers did not. That power is brief, but structure is lasting. Still, the image lingers. An emperor with a limp and a stammer, betrayed by those closest to him, dying with poison on his breath and politics in the air. And one question remains. Did the empire mourn him, or simply move on, as it always did? The Roman Empire, for all its grandeur and glory, had a peculiar way of discarding its emperors. Some were immortalized in marble, others were erased, their names chipped off stone walls and their statues toppled in disgrace. And then there were the ones like Claudius, quietly sidelined by time, their accomplishments left standing even as their memories faded. After his death in 54 CE, Claudius was deified, an honor granted to most emperors, even those who died suspiciously. Temples were erected, coins were struck, prayers were said in his name. But unlike Augustus, whose name became synonymous with stability, or Julius Caesar, who was invoked as a god of divine lineage, Claudius's divinity felt more ceremonial than heartfelt. The Senate offered their tribute, the people muttered their approval. But within the palace, Agrippina and Nero had already moved on. It was Nero who gave Claudius's eulogy. The words were carefully crafted, ghost-written by Seneca, his tutor. Polished, formal, dutiful. But even then, a quiet tension hung in the air. Did Nero grieve? Did he pretend to? Or was the eulogy simply a formality, a performance to mark the transition of power? The records suggest that Nero began to subtly undo Claudius's legacy almost immediately. He reversed policies, marginalized the freedmen who had supported Claudius. He moved swiftly to eliminate Britannicus, the only rival left standing. And perhaps most revealing of all, he had Claudius's final wife, his own mother Agrippina, murdered just a few years later. The irony was thick. The woman who had likely orchestrated Claudius's death met her own end at the hands of the very emperor she had created. And yet, through all this bloodshed and ambition, Claudius's work endured. His reign, often remembered for its awkward beginning and suspicious end, was one of quiet stability. He expanded the empire, not only with armies but with laws. He brought order to the bureaucracy. He appointed provincial governors based on merit, not just birth. He allowed Gauls into the Senate, an act considered radical at the time, hinting at a more inclusive vision of Rome. He wrote prolifically, though most of his works have been lost. Histories of Carthage and Etruria, a treatise on dice, a defense of Cicero. These were not the writings of a fool, but of a mind deeply engaged with the past, with language, with structure. Suetonius even claimed Claudius invented 3 new letters for the Latin alphabet, an act of linguistic reform centuries ahead of its time. So how did such a man come to be remembered mostly for being poisoned by a mushroom? Part of the answer lies in the very nature of Roman history. The sources we rely on, Tacitus, Suetonius, Dio, wrote with bias. They often saw Claudius through the lens of his physical ailments and court gossip. His stammer was mistaken for stupidity, his limp for weakness. His trust in freedmen and scholars was seen as naivete. But perhaps that's the tragedy of Claudius. Not that he was killed by poison, but that he was never truly understood while alive. He governed not with charisma, but with diligence. He lacked flair but had foresight. He wasn't born to rule, yet ruled better than many who were, and maybe, just maybe, that's why he had to die. In the politics of Rome, it wasn't enough to be competent. One had to be ruthless, theatrical, adored, feared. Claudius was none of these. He was a historian in the emperor's seat, a scholar with a scepter, and in the end, that made him expendable. His death, silent, shadowed, suspicious, has remained a curiosity for nearly 2,000 years. But it also serves as a quiet symbol of the Roman paradox, that greatness could exist without spectacle, and that those who built the foundations were rarely the ones celebrated in the statues. So if you ever walk the ruins of ancient Rome and see an aqueduct standing tall, or stumble upon an inscription bearing the name Tiberius Claudius Caesar, Augustus Germanicus, pause for a moment, not for the poison, not for the mushroom, but for the quiet emperor who gave Rome order before being erased by those who wanted noise. And ask yourself, how many leaders have been forgotten not because they failed, but because they succeeded without needing to be seen? The Dead Sea is a place where nothing grows. Its shores are dry, cracked like broken pottery, and its water is so dense with salt that the body floats whether it wants to or not. The hills that rise above it are as silent as any cemetery. But somewhere along its edge, in the arid heat of southern Jordan or Israel, stands, or once stood, a pillar of salt. Not carved by human hands, not marked with any inscription. Just a crumbling, pale formation shaped vaguely like a person. Locals say it's Lot's wife. The Bible, in its brisk and cryptic way, gives her no name, no voice, no thoughts. She appears only for a moment, and then disappears, literally, turned, into a pillar of salt for the simple act of looking over her shoulder. Genesis 19 tells the story. Lot was the nephew of Abraham. He lived in Sodom, a city infamous for its corruption and violence. When God decided to destroy Sodom and its neighboring city, Gomorrah, 2 angels were sent to warn Lot. He was told to flee with his family, immediately. No lingering, no hesitations. "Flee to the mountains," they said. "Do not look back." And so, with dawn breaking and fire descending, Lot ran. His wife ran beside him, and then, just once, she turned. The scripture says simply, "But Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt." No detail, no elaboration, just a consequence. But what did that moment look like? What did it feel like? Was it instinct? The sound of home being destroyed, too loud to ignore? Was it disbelief, mourning? Was it fear? Or was it something simpler, human? Curiosity. The story has endured for centuries, but it is in what it doesn't say that the real story begins. Because who was she? What was her name? In later Jewish tradition, she is called Ado or Idit. Some say she was from Sodom herself. Others say she was a foreigner. In one tradition, she was sympathetic to the people of Sodom, reluctant to leave them behind. In another, she had already betrayed her guests to the townspeople, and her punishment was just. But these are interpretations layered over time. The Bible itself offers no motive, no background. She is simply Lot's wife, defined by her relationship to her husband, by her failure to obey, by her transformation. Yet it's strange, isn't it? Of all the punishments in the Hebrew Bible, hers is one of the most poetic. Not fire, not drowning, not exile, but salt. a permanent fixture, a monument in the very substance of the land to a single human action. Salt in ancient cultures had meaning. It was a preservative, a purifier, a symbol of permanence and covenant. It flavored food. It was traded as currency. And yet, too, much salt, like too much of anything, could kill. To become salt was not to disappear, but to endure in stillness. And so, for thousands of years, people have walked the banks of the Dead Sea and asked themselves, was she real? Did a woman once stand on this soil and turn back, only to become a statue of herself? The geology of the region doesn't help us much. The area is dotted with natural salt pillars, formed over millennia by evaporation and mineral deposits. Some look vaguely human, others not at all. One particularly tall formation, near Mount Sodom, is commonly referred to as Lot's wife. Tourists take photos beside it. Children are told the story in whispers and warnings. But it's not the shape of the rock that matters. It's the shape of the idea. In a story of divine judgment and human destruction, Lot's wife becomes the symbol not of evil, but of pause, of hesitation, of memory. Because to turn back in that moment is not just to defy a command, it is to acknowledge what is being lost, the life left behind, the house, the streets, the neighbors. Even if those things were broken, they were familiar. Even if they were dangerous, they were home. And so she looked. And in that looking, she was stopped forever. Not running, not walking, just still in salt. But what happened just before she turned? What were her final thoughts as Sodom burned behind her? In most stories of escape, we remember those who fled, their courage, their speed, their will to live. But in the story of Lot's wife, what lingers is not her flight, but her pause, her fatal pause. And in that pause, there is something deeply human. We don't know how far she had run before she looked back. A mile? Half a day's journey? Genesis doesn't say. We don't know whether she slowed first, if her steps faltered, if her breath grew heavy as firelight crept over the desert behind them. We know only that she turned, and that it was not permitted. The Bible gives no dialogue, no final words. She was not granted a monologue, no farewell or lament. Unlike Job, who cried out in suffering, or Moses, who questioned God face to face, Lot's wife is silent. Her voice has been lost, but her story has not. For thousands of years, commentators and scribes have tried to fill the silence. Rabbinic. Texts from the Talmud suggest she turned back out of regret, that her heart still belonged to Sodom. One interpretation imagines her looking back not in sadness, but in defiance. Another claims she had delayed, lingering to gather her things, and was punished for loving possessions more than salvation. Still others have been more sympathetic. The medieval Jewish philosopher Maimonides suggested that the punishment was not magical at all, but natural, that the region, already unstable and rich in bitumen and sulfur, exploded in a geological event so violent that a single misstep, or a pause to look, was enough to claim a life. Today, some scientists and historians have speculated that the destruction of Sodom may be rooted in a real catastrophe. Earthquake faults run through the Jordan Rift Valley. Methane, sulfur, and other flammable gases are present in the land. The 1920 Jericho earthquake killed hundreds and shook the same region. Could a city have once been destroyed in a burst of fire and brimstone? Could a woman fleeing that chaos have turned too soon and been swallowed not by myth but by ash? Perhaps, but whether historical or symbolic, the salt remains. Salt preserves and salt erases. Salt keeps the body from rotting, but it also sterilizes the land. It makes things last but not grow. And in becoming salt, Lot's wife became both memorial and warning. She became something to remember and something to fear. In Christian tradition, her story appears again, briefly, in the Gospel of Luke. Remember Lot's wife, Jesus says. Just that, a simple command, a single sentence, a warning against looking back when the call is to move forward. But what was she leaving behind? Sodom is remembered now only for its wickedness, but no city is just one thing. It was a place where she likely had friends, perhaps family, a place where she knew the market stalls, the names of neighbors, the way the shadows fell across her. doorway in the evening. To run from it, even if it was broken, meant running from familiarity into uncertainty, and maybe for a heartbeat that felt like too much. So she turned, and in doing so, she became still. Frozen in time, her last act not a rebellion or a failure, but a moment of remembering. It's possible, isn't it, that she wasn't trying to disobey, that she wasn't trying to challenge divine instruction. Maybe she just wanted one last look at the place that had shaped her. The tragedy is not just that she turned, but that we know nothing of what she saw. No witness to Sodom's fall. No voice to describe the sky, the flames, the noise, or the silence after. Only salt. Only silence. And only the rest of her family running forward, unable or unwilling to turn and see what she had become. Did Lot ever stop? Did he ever retrace his steps and see the pillar? Did he tell his daughters years later about their mother, who had looked once too often at the world they'd left behind? Or did they all keep walking, eyes forward, pretending she had never paused? The Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth's surface, a basin where nothing drains, where the water that enters stays, evaporates, or turns to brine. It is not a sea in the traditional sense, but a graveyard for rivers, a destination of finality. Is here, along this bleak and glimmering shore, that people still look for Lot's wife. Tour guides point out a tall column of salt-encrusted rock near Mount Sodom and call it by her name. It's cracked and weathered, a natural formation by all geological standards, but stories don't always yield to geology. Pilgrims still come, travelers still stare, and across generations, people have believed they saw her face in the stone. Her, eyes frozen in grief, her mouth caught between breath and prayer, she never moves. That's the power of salt. It preserves. And in this way, Lot's wife became something rare in ancient literature. A woman remembered for a single moment, not for bearing a great leader, not for influencing a kingdom, not even for delivering a speech. Just one act, one glance. And yet it is enough to keep her present. Perhaps this is why her story has been told and retold, not only in religious texts, but in art, poetry, folklore, and philosophy. The idea that a person can become trapped in the past so fully and permanently is not limited to faith. It is part of the human condition. In Dante's Inferno, she becomes a metaphor for frozen longing. In some Eastern Orthodox interpretations, her transformation is a symbol of judgment without mercy. In modern literature, she is sometimes reimagined as a woman who dared to feel, who dared to look when others would not. But through all the interpretations, one theme remains: stillness. Lot's wife becomes the embodiment of what happens when movement stops, when obedience gives way to memory, when survival is not enough to silence grief. And maybe that's what makes her story so unsettling. Because most stories of survival ask us to forget, to let go, to press forward. But she reminds us that sometimes the past won't be left behind so easily, that we are not only creatures of direction, but also of reflection, and that occasionally looking back is not weakness but mourning. Imagine just for a moment what she might have seen: the city she once called home lit by fire, its gates breaking, its people scattering, the noise of destruction carried on. Desert wind, the smoke rising over familiar rooftops, perhaps even the outline of a marketplace she once walked, a neighbor's home, a friend's balcony, and then the sudden chill, the sharp sting of change, the breath caught mid-turn, the awareness maybe that she had disobeyed, or maybe not even that. Maybe there was no moment of realization, just a body gone still and a memory sealed in salt. We don't know what became of her pillar. Some say it still stands. Others say it eroded long ago, crumbled back into the mineral-rich soil. Nature reabsorbing myth, time reclaiming story. But the idea remains as fixed as any statue, as unchanging as any law. A woman unnamed and unloved by the text, who could not stop herself from turning around. And in doing so, she became part of the land, part of the landscape. A question forever etched into the desert. Was it really a sin to look back? When history remembers inventors, it often remembers the heroic ones. Edison with his light bulb, Bell with the telephone, Tesla with his thunder. But few people remember Thomas Migley Jr., a soft-spoken, well-educated American chemist whose inventions shaped the 20th century more profoundly than most presidents, and not for the better. Born in 1889 in Beaver Falls, Pennsylvania, Migley grew up in a world just beginning to modernize. Gas lights were giving way to electricity. Horses still clattered through the streets, but automobiles were creeping in. Factories hissed and bellowed. Science was the future, and it was exciting. Migley studied mechanical engineering at Cornell and soon found himself working for General Motors. It was here, amid the laboratories and ledgers of early 20th century industrial America, that his talents began to show. He wasn't flashy. He didn't chase fame. But he had a gift, the ability to solve complex chemical problems with neat, elegant answers. His first major challenge? Knocking. Not the sound of someone at the door, but the pinging, rattling explosion that plagued early car engines. When gasoline ignited unevenly in the cylinder, it caused engine knock, a sound that meant inefficiency, lost power, and long-term damage. Engineers had tried everything, different fuels, additives, mixtures. Nothing worked well, until Migley in 1921 discovered that adding a compound called tetraethyl lead to gasoline dramatically reduced knocking. It was a small chemical tweak with massive consequences. The invention was hailed as revolutionary. Engines ran smoother. Cars became more efficient. General Motors, Standard Oil, and DuPont quickly formed a joint venture to produce and market the new additive under the name ethyl. But there was a problem. Lead, even in small quantities, is profoundly toxic. Migley knew this. His team knew this. Workers in ethyl plants began to suffer hallucinations, seizures, and in some cases died. At one plant in New Jersey, 5 men died and 35 others were hospitalized. Still, the companies pressed forward, insisting it was safe. Migley even held a demonstration for the press, rubbing tetraethyl lead on his hands and inhaling its fumes to prove its safety. "I could do this every day," he claimed. Privately, he took a long vacation to recover from lead poisoning, but the additive worked. It made engines better, and that was enough. The US government, lacking modern environmental regulation, did not intervene. For the next 50 years, leaded gasoline would dominate the global market, spewing microscopic particles of neurotoxin into the air, contaminating soil, harming children, and accumulating in bloodstreams worldwide. By the time unleaded gasoline began to replace it in the 1970s, it's estimated that hundreds of thousands, if not millions of lives had been negatively impacted, but Migley wasn't done. In the 1930s, he moved on to another project: refrigeration. Early refrigerators used chemicals like ammonia, propane, or sulfur dioxide as coolants. They were efficient but dangerous. Leaks could be lethal. Explosions were not uncommon. The industry needed something safer, more stable, more consumer-friendly. And again, Migley delivered. He developed chlorofluorocarbons, CFCs. They were non-toxic, non-flammable, and remarkably effective at transferring heat. His team branded the first compound Freon. It was adopted rapidly by refrigerator manufacturers, air conditioners, and aerosol sprays. It seemed like another miracle. No one realized that CFCs, once released into the atmosphere, would drift upward, high into the stratosphere, where ultraviolet radiation would break them down, releasing chlorine atoms that destroyed the Earth's ozone layer. It would take decades to understand the scale of this damage. By then, Thomas Migley Jr. had already stepped away from chemistry, having received dozens of awards and accolades. He was a celebrated inventor, a respected thinker, a problem solver, but his body had begun to fail him. In 1940, at age 51, Migley contracted polio. The disease left him severely disabled, unable to walk. For someone so intellectually agile, the physical confinement must have been especially cruel. He relied on others for daily care. Movement became a challenge. Privacy, even in his own home, was limited, and so, true to form, Migley designed a solution. He created an elaborate system of ropes and pulleys attached to a harness that allowed him to lift himself from bed. It was clever, ingenious even, a testament to his engineering mind. But on November 2nd, 1944, something went wrong. Migley became entangled in the device. Whether it was a malfunction, a misstep, or a simple error, no one knows for sure. He was found strangled by the very system he had built to regain his freedom, a man killed by his own invention. In a quiet bedroom in Ohio, the final chapter of a story that had already shaped the world, often invisibly, often tragically, came to a close. But the consequences of his work did not. They lingered, in the air, in the soil, in the clouds. And the real question that followed him into history wasn't how he died. It was how many unknowingly lived in the shadow of what he had made. In the years after Thomas Migley's death in 1944, the world kept using his ideas. Leaded gasoline, despite mounting evidence of its harm, remained the norm for decades. The compound he had popularized, tetrethyl lead, was mixed into billions of gallons of fuel, burned in engines across the globe. Every car ride, every plane, every bus. A microscopic plume of lead dust expelled into the atmosphere, inhaled. By lungs too small to protest, it settled into playgrounds, into windowsills, into the bones of children. In post-war America, suburban families filled their cars and cooled their homes, unknowingly wrapped in the invisible reach of Migley's creations. Freon too quietly filled refrigerators and air conditioners. It felt like comfort, progress, cleanliness, but it wasn't. By the 1960s, researchers began sounding alarms. In urban centers, lead poisoning rates soared, especially among children. Behavioral issues, learning difficulties, and stunted development became too frequent to ignore. The link between environmental lead exposure and cognitive decline grew clearer. And then, in 1974, the real crisis emerged. Scientists Sherwood Rowland and Mario Molina published a groundbreaking paper revealing that CFCs, like the Freon Migley, had pioneered, were destroying the ozone layer. That thin, fragile shield in the upper atmosphere that protects Earth from ultraviolet radiation. They discovered that even a single chlorine atom released by a CFC molecule could destroy thousands of ozone molecules. It was not a localized problem. It was planetary. And slowly a grim realization spread through scientific and political circles. One man, working from a place of industry and innovation, had inadvertently caused two of the largest environmental crises of the 20th century. Not through malice, not even through negligence, but through solutions. Midgley didn't live to see this reckoning. His legacy, at least in public awareness, remained quiet, obscure. He was not demonized nor particularly remembered. His name appeared in chemistry texts, in patent documents, in corporate histories, but not in newspapers, not in speeches. He faded from public consciousness, even as his inventions remained in every engine and refrigerator. And that's part of what makes his story so unnerving. Most dangerous figures in history are dramatic, conquerors, despots, revolutionaries, but Migley was none of these. He was, by most accounts, a kind man, methodical, professional, driven by curiosity, not power. His downfall was not ambition, but trust. In technology, in industry, in the belief that cleverness could outpace consequence, and in that, he became a kind of tragic archetype, the brilliant mind who sees the problem, solves it, and never looks far enough to see what the solution becomes. Decades later, in the 1980s, the hole in the ozone layer became visible from space. The world panicked. International leaders gathered. The Montreal Protocol was signed in 1987, phasing out CFCs worldwide. It remains one of the most successful environmental agreements in history, but the damage, while reversible, was vast. As for leaded gasoline, the United States began phasing it out in the 1970s. It wasn't banned entirely until 1996. Some countries continued to use it even into the 2000s. The World Health Organization eventually declared lead exposure a major global health threat, and still, few knew the name Thomas Migley Jr. His portrait does not hang in any major museum. There are no public memorials, no bronze statues in academic courtyards. His legacy is one that history, perhaps deliberately, chose not to enshrine. Because it is not a legacy of triumph, but of warning. In science classrooms, he is sometimes mentioned as an example of unintended consequences, a case study in caution, a reminder that every invention, no matter how helpful in the moment, carries a shadow. But Migley was not a monster. He was a mirror, a reflection of 20th century optimism, of the belief that nature could be managed, that chemistry could civilize, that the world's problems were simply puzzles waiting to be solved with the right compound, the right formula, the right machine. And what makes his story so haunting is that he was right. He did solve the problems, just not the ones he created. It is difficult to measure the impact of one man's work when the effects are both invisible and everywhere. Thomas Migley Jr. never led armies or held office. He never wrote laws or gave speeches. He never launched a campaign. And yet his ideas, his chemicals, his fixes shaped the breath of generations. It's an odd thing to consider, that you could walk down a street in the 1950s, inhale deeply, and draw a microscopic fragment of his legacy into your lungs. That a child's hand on a windowsill in Detroit or a riverbank in Delhi might carry the residue of a choice made in a General Motors lab decades before. That air conditioners around the world quietly emitted his invention into the sky, where it drifted, slowly, unchallenged, until the Earth itself began to change, and yet he remains largely absent from collective memory. No high school curriculum teaches his name. No public plaques commemorate his patents. He did not become a cautionary tale, not loudly anyway. Why? Perhaps because he doesn't fit the story we like to tell about inventors. Midgley was not evil. He did not ignore science maliciously. He was thoughtful, intelligent, and at least at first, cautiously aware of the risks. But he lived in an age that prioritized function over foresight, an age where industry surged ahead of regulation, where solving the immediate problem was not only encouraged, it was rewarded. Midgley received the Priestley Medal. To the Willard Gibbs Award, membership in the National Academy of Sciences. He was a hero of American innovation, but he did not live to see the undoing. By the 1990s, scientists were tracing childhood behavioral problems directly to lead exposure. Economists linked urban crime rates and educational setbacks to the lingering effects of environmental lead, decades after its widespread use. Atmospheric scientists confirmed that CFCs had thinned the ozone layer by billions of tons, allowing ultraviolet rays to reach Earth more intensely. And all of it had begun, in part, with him. By the time the world fully understood what Midgley had done, he was long gone. The pulley system he designed to lift himself, his final invention, had failed him, leaving him tangled in the very mechanics that were meant to restore his dignity. In a cruelly poetic way, it was a fitting end. Not because it was deserved, but because it mirrored everything his career had represented, a solution born of ingenuity that quietly turned into a trap. He is now remembered, when he is remembered at all, through a strange phrase coined by environmental historian John Robert McNeill. Midgley had more impact on the atmosphere than any other single organism in Earth's history. Not Alexander, not Genghis Khan, not any king or emperor, a chemist from Ohio. And still, it would be wrong to cast him as a villain. His story is not a warning against inventing or against chemistry. It is a reminder that consequences often arrive, quietly, long after the applause has faded. That the most dangerous inventions aren't always the ones designed to kill, but the ones designed to help, without enough thought to what happens next. Today, the ozone layer is slowly healing. Global agreements, hard-fought and fragile, have made a difference. Lead has largely vanished from gasoline and paint. Children in many parts of the world now breathe easier, learn better, live longer. But Midgley's story remains in the air. In every regulation, in every cautious pause before a new chemical is released, in every environmental review board, a man who never saw a battlefield, but whose legacy left a mark on every continent. He died in silence, but his inventions whispered for decades. So now when you breathe, especially on a hot day cooled by clean, safe air, or when you walk through a city no longer dusted with lead, you are walking through the memory of a man whose greatest strength was also his greatest flaw. He was too good at solving the problem right in front of him, and he never asked, what comes after? In the royal courts of old India, laughter was both ritual and performance. Courtiers laughed to please, to flatter, to fill the air between heavy silences with something soft. But not all laughter was staged, and not all of it ended well. In the 13th century, the city of Vijayanagara had not yet risen. Delhi was yet to become an imperial capital. Much of southern India was divided into smaller kingdoms, each ruled by regional dynasties with their own customs, palaces, languages, and stories. Among these stories is a small, nearly forgotten, thread from the court of the Hoysala Empire, nestled in present-day Karnataka. At its heart is a woman named Sunanda Bai, a queen known not for her politics or lineage, but for something far stranger. She reportedly died from laughter. The tale is short, peculiar, and blurred by time. The story comes to us primarily through local chronicles and oral traditions, recorded by later writers. There is no royal edict, no carved stone decree, just the soft outline of a moment so absurd it was never quite believed, and yet never quite forgotten. Queen Sunanda Bai, wife of King Narasimha III, lived in the court of Dwarasamudra, one of the Hoysala capitals, surrounded by towering temples and lotus-filled tanks. She was said to be clever, well-read, and fond of conversation. Court musicians praised her wit. Even foreign envoys, according to some retellings, noted the queen's ability to dissolve tense moments with her lightness of speech. But one evening, as the story goes, she was watching a performance in the court. Some say it was a mime. Others claim it was a jester, telling a sequence of increasingly ridiculous tales. One of them, just one, was so profoundly absurd that the queen began to laugh, and she didn't stop. Laughter turned to gasping, gasping to wheezing. Her body shook, her face flushed. Courtiers reportedly tried to calm her. Servants brought water. A physician was summoned. But the queen's laughter spiraled, unstoppable, unbreathable. And then, silence. The records simply say, she passed in joy. No cause of death was officially noted, but those who were there would say for generations after that Queen Sunanda Bai had died from laughter, an excess of mirth that overcame her body's ability to breathe. Could it be true? Modern medicine offers a possible explanation. There is a rare condition called asphyxiation-induced syncope, where extreme laughter can trigger a drop in blood pressure, restrict oxygen, and cause collapse. In individuals with underlying heart conditions, or while in tightly corseted clothing, as royal women often were, prolonged laughter could have triggered cardiac arrest or suffocation. A handful of similar cases exist in medical literature. In the 20th century, several individuals reportedly died while watching comedy films, their bodies overwhelmed by spasms of laughter. The incidents are rare, strange, difficult to prove, but not impossible. And in the age of the Hoysalas, where medicine leaned more toward ritual than diagnosis, a sudden, inexplicable death was often left to story. Sunanda Bai's passing was not recorded as tragedy. No poems of mourning have survived, no shrines were built in her name. She is remembered, if at all, through a single oddity, the queen who laughed too hard, the woman who found something so amusing she forgot to survive it. But was her laughter joyful, or was it nervous? In the courts of old India, the line between entertainment and subtle mockery was often thin. Performers used riddles and tales to comment on power, to gently tease rulers, to say the unspeakable in the language of metaphor. Perhaps Sunanda Bai heard something in that performance, some small truth buried in comedy, that struck her so deeply her body could not contain it. Or perhaps she had been holding in sorrow for too long, and laughter gave it a way out. Too fast, too soon, too full. Her body could not keep up. Either way, the result was the same. A royal woman whose last moment was not one of despair, but of uncontrollable laughter. And the question we're left with centuries later is, was it a good way to go? In the days following the Queen's death, the palace of Dwarasamudra must have grown strangely quiet. Not the hush of grief one might expect from a court mourning a royal figurehead. No, this was a different kind of silence. The awkward stillness That follows an absurd accident. A royal woman had died of laughter. What, after all, could one say? There were no wars sparked, no succession crises, no great political fallout. Queen Sunanda Bai had no known heirs. Her marriage to King Narasimha III was thought to be one of formality more than romance. She held a ceremonial role, respected, yes, but largely distant from matters of governance. But something changed after her death. According to palace folklore collected centuries later, the court's relationship with laughter became complicated. Royal entertainers, jesters, dancers, mimics were subtly discouraged. Their acts were toned down, their cleverness dulled. Laughter, once a symbol of good fortune and lightness in the Hoysala court, took on a darker hue, as if it could no longer be trusted. One early 14th century poet, writing nearly 100 years after her death, referred to the queen who breathed her last in joy and left behind a court afraid to smile. Whether he meant it literally or figuratively, the idea lingered, and in that silence, her image began to shift. In some accounts, Sunanda Bai became a symbol of divine delight, proof that joy too can carry a person into the afterlife. Her sudden death was seen as a kind of transcendence, a moment of pure, unfiltered feeling that lifted her beyond the material world. In this view, she became a sort of spiritual figure, an embodiment of the idea that even bliss taken too far becomes unearthly. But in other retellings, especially among the more skeptical Brahmin chroniclers, her death was viewed as a warning. A woman who laughed when she should have been composed. A royal who failed to maintain her posture. Some hinted that her passing was a punishment, for vanity, for gossip, for amusement at sacred things. The story became a morality tale, urging restraint, humility, modesty. And that's where the ambiguity begins. Because while the Queen's actual death was strange, its memory became a mirror, reflecting whatever values the next generation chose to see. In temples and schools, she was either a joyful spirit or a lesson in excess. In tavern songs, she became a figure of dark comedy, the queen who could not breathe between her giggles. Rarely, though, was she remembered as a full person. We know so little about her. Was she young, old, childless, beloved? There are no inscriptions, no coins, no temple endowments in her name. Even the records of her family are sparse. The Hoysala kings built stunning temples like those at Halebidu and Belur, but no carvings depict her directly. Her life left almost no trace, beyond this one absurd event, and yet the idea of her has endured, not as a figure of power, but as a figure of fragility. A reminder that even in royal courts, where everything is designed to be controlled, a moment of genuine emotion can upend everything. Some modern scholars have argued that the story of Sunanda Bai is probably exaggerated, or even invented entirely, that the idea of someone dying from laughter fits more neatly into folklore than fact. They note the absence of direct inscriptions, the folkloric nature of the sources, the centuries of embellishment that followed, but that, in itself, is telling. Because stories of queens in medieval India were usually serious, tragic, heroic, martyrdom, sacrifice, loyalty. These were the acceptable motifs. To die of laughter? That was not a trope. It was too strange, too intimate, too human, which is perhaps why it endured. Today, Dwarasamudra is known as Halebidu. The temples are weathered but still standing. Tourists walk among the stone elephants and finely carved ceilings, unaware that somewhere beneath their feet, a queen once laughed so hard she never stood again. And whether it was joy or something else entirely, we still don't know what exactly she was laughing at. Was it just a joke, or something deeper? Centuries after the Queen's passing, when the Hoysala Empire had crumbled under the weight of invasions and shifting power, a traveler passed through the ruins of Dwarasamudra. He was a Jain monk heading west, and in his travel diary, a quiet text written in Kannada, he noted a curious story he'd heard from an old woman who swept the temple steps. There was once a queen, the woman had said, who laughed and never stopped. Her voice echoed off these walls. Now the stone remembers her. It is the only surviving record that connects a voice to Sunanda Bai. A single, passing memory. Perhaps it's fiction. Perhaps it's truth softened by time. But either way, it tells us something about how the Queen's laughter did not vanish. It soaked into the very walls of her palace, becoming part of the folklore of a fading city. By then, the Hoysalas were long gone. Their temples, though exquisite, had been partially destroyed, looted, and overtaken by vegetation. Only the carvings remained, gods and dancers frozen mid-step. The world had moved on. But the story of the Queen who died laughing persisted, passed not in books but in quiet retellings, and in this way, her story became something larger than a royal accident. It became a reflection of how history treats joy. We often remember tragedy. Kings who fell in battle, queens who drank poison, dynasties ended by betrayal. But we rarely remember joy, especially in its pure, unrestrained form. Laughter in history leaves no monuments. It is too quick, too ephemeral, too difficult to carve in stone. But somehow, Sunanda Bai's laughter stayed, not as a sound, but as a question. Did she die because her joy was too great? Or did she laugh because she was finally, if briefly, free? There's a kind of poetic justice in the possibility that her final moment was not defined by duty, protocol, or power, but by absurdity. That, in a world so often dictated by control, her last breath was uncontrollable. And that's perhaps the quiet defiance of her story. We don't know the joke. We don't know the performer. We don't know what turned the Queen's breath into laughter and the laughter into silence. But we do know this. She laughed in the middle of a royal court. Before 100 silent men, she laughed, and it echoed. And in doing so, she did something few in history have done. She left behind a memory not of violence or grief or sacrifice, but of joy. A joy so overwhelming it defied explanation. A joy so sudden, so unchecked, so full that her body could not hold it. And while her name has nearly vanished from the pages of history, her story remains tucked into the margins, into the small spaces where humor and mortality meet. A queen remembered not for the crown she wore, but for the sound she made as it slipped from her head. And so we're left with one last simple thought. In a world that remembers so many ways to die, how rare is it really to be remembered for laughing? On a cold morning in the early 16th century, a man was led to a wooden stake in the town of Vilvoorde, in what is now Belgium. He was chained, surrounded by clergy, soldiers, and a crowd of curious onlookers. The man, thin, solemn, resolved, was not a warrior nor a traitor. His crime? Translating the Bible into English, his name was William Tyndale, and his final words before the executioner's rope pulled tight around his neck were quiet but clear. Lord, open the King of England's eyes. He died in silence. But his words did not. Tyndale's life began in rural Gloucestershire around 1494. England at that time was devoutly Catholic, and scripture was read exclusively in Latin. To question this was not only discouraged, it was illegal. The idea that ordinary people might read the Bible for themselves in their own language was considered dangerous, heretical, even revolutionary. Tyndale did not agree. He was educated at Oxford and Cambridge, bright, fluent in multiple languages, a scholar of Greek and Hebrew. And more than that, he was driven by a radical, dangerous idea that scripture was not the private property of priests. That truth should be readable, understandable, human. At one dinner, when debating a cleric who claimed that people needed the Pope more than the Bible, Tyndale reportedly snapped, "If God spare my life, I will cause a boy that driveth the plough to know more of the scripture than thou dost." It was a line he never took back, but in England, printing the Bible in English was a crime. Translating it from the original languages worse. And so Tyndale fled to the European continent, where the Protestant Reformation was just beginning to spread. In Germany, he worked in secrecy, in hidden rooms under candlelight surrounded by presses and parchment. The printing press, still a relatively new technology, was dangerous in the hands of someone like Tyndale. It could copy text not in tens but in thousands. Ideas could spread faster than kings could suppress them. In 1526, the first copies of Tyndale's English New Testament appeared. They were slim, plain, affordable, smuggled into England in crates, full of grain, cloth, or barrels of oil. They circulated underground, read by candlelight, shared in whispers, passed from hand to hand like contraband. The reaction from the English church was immediate and furious. Bishop Tunstall of London gathered the books and publicly burned them. Sir Thomas More, Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor, launched a bitter campaign to track Tyndale down, calling him a beast and a hellhound in the kennel of the devil. Monks preached sermons against him. Spies were sent to the continent, but still the books came in and people read them. Tyndale's translation was revolutionary not just because it was in English, but because of how it was written. His language was clear, beautiful, accessible. Phrases like "let there be light," "the powers that be," "a law unto themselves," "filthy lucre," and "scapegoat" came not from Shakespeare or Chaucer, but from Tyndale. He shaped the sound of English long before modern English even existed, but he was not just a translator, he was also a reformer. In later writings, he criticized the Catholic Church's wealth, its corruption, its use of Latin to obscure rather than enlighten. He believed in direct access to God, in Scripture as personal nourishment, in grace as a gift, not a transaction. And that, more than his translation, made him dangerous. By 1535, after years of hiding and evading capture, Tyndale was betrayed by a man he thought was a friend, a fellow Englishman who gained his trust, then turned him in to the authorities. Tyndale was arrested near Antwerp, taken to Vilvoorde Castle, and held in harsh conditions for over a year. He asked for a Hebrew Bible, warm clothing, a lamp, and still he worked, translating, writing, studying. He knew he would not be released. In 1536, after a brief and mostly symbolic trial, he was sentenced to death. Because he was a priest, he was granted the mercy of strangulation before his body was burned. No elaborate speeches, no resistance, just a short prayer. "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," and then silence. But less than a year later, that prayer would begin to echo in the halls of power. When William Tyndale was executed in 1536, his books were already illegal in England. His name was spoken in whispers, his face unknown to most, his fate meant to be a warning. And yet, even before his body cooled, his words were being read in secret by farmers, merchants, and even members of the English court. Because the thing about a printed word, once it's out, it cannot be caught. It had taken years of painstaking labor to produce that first English New Testament. Tyndale had translated it directly from Greek, bypassing the Latin Vulgate used by the Catholic Church. His English was direct, rhythmic, and modern, compared to the older, stiffer translations used behind church walls. His sentences carried the clarity of someone writing for the ear, not for the scholar, and it spread. Smugglers became unlikely revolutionaries. Ships slipped into English harbors with pages hidden in cargo. Readers gathered in basements and behind locked doors. Some were caught. Some were whipped, imprisoned, or burned with the very books they had dared to open. But still, the texts moved. And then something strange happened. Tyndale's final prayer, "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," may have landed. In 1537, just 1 year after Tyndale's death, an English Bible was printed and distributed with official permission. It was called the Matthew Bible, compiled by another reformer, John Rogers, using Tyndale's own translations for much of the text. Henry VIII, the very monarch whose court had hunted Tyndale, authorized it. By 1539, another version followed, the Great Bible, also based largely on Tyndale's work. This time it was distributed to every parish church in England. It was chained to pulpits so that the public could read it aloud, but not remove it. The language was familiar, the turns of phrase unmistakable. Though his name was not always acknowledged, the fingerprints of Tyndale were everywhere. He had won, quietly, posthumously, but fully. Rogers, who published the first complete English Bible under the pseudonym Thomas Matthew, would later be executed as well. Burned under Queen Mary I, he became the first Protestant martyr of her reign. In death, he joined the long line of men who had died so others could read, but Tyndale remained the root. Later, when King James I commissioned a new English translation of the Bible in 1604, the version that would become the King James Bible, scholars found themselves unable to improve on Tyndale's language. It is estimated that more than 80% of the New Testament in the King James Version is taken word for word from Tyndale. In the Old Testament books he lived long enough to translate, the percentage is similar. He had written in exile. He had published in secret. He had died in chains. By the time the King James Bible was published in 1611, 75 years after William Tyndale's death, it had become the most widely read book in the English-speaking world. It would remain so for centuries, in churches, in homes, in schools, in courtrooms. For many it was not just scripture, it was language itself, and so much of it came from the pen of a man long dead, long hunted, long erased. Tyndale never saw his work reach the cathedral. He never sat beside bishops. He never returned to England. His bones were never recovered. No tombstone bears his name. But his phrases, his clear, sharp English, outlived those who condemned him. Words like, "Let there be light, fight the good fight, the powers that be. It came. To pass my brother's keeper, seek and ye shall find." These are not just Bible verses. They are turns of phrase woven into the structure of English thought. They shaped how people prayed, how they comforted, how they dreamed. In courtrooms, people swore oaths on a book whose language came from a man the law once hunted. In Parliament, leaders quoted from his translation, often unknowingly. And still Tyndale remains mostly unknown outside scholarly circles. Perhaps that's part of his strange legacy. He wasn't looking for fame. He wasn't a theologian building a church. He wasn't a rebel raising arms. He was a linguist, a translator. A man with the quiet conviction that truth belongs to everyone, and that language should serve, not obscure. He could have lived a comfortable life in England had he stayed within the church's bounds. He could have chosen obscurity over exile. But instead, he ran a race he knew he wouldn't finish. He printed books that would be burned. He wrote for readers he would never meet, and in the end, he died for something as simple and as powerful as clarity. There is a strange, soft victory in that. Not the kind with statues or hymns, but the kind that endures because no one can quite remove it. The kind that slips into the bloodstream of culture until no one remembers where it came from, only that it's there. In a world full of noise, Tyndale chose a whisper made of words, precise, spare, unshakable, and that whisper endured his final prayer. "Lord, open the King of England's eyes," was not only answered, it was multiplied. It opened the eyes of millions. It changed the very sound of faith. And it left us with a haunting truth, that sometimes the most lasting revolutions begin with a man at a desk, translating in silence. The morning of July 11, 1804, began with mist rising gently off the Hudson River. Boats bobbed in the current. A rocky patch of land near Weehawken, New Jersey, sat quiet beneath the cliffs, unremarkable to most. But that morning, 2 men rode there under cover of early light. One would leave bleeding, the other would leave ruined. This is the story of the duel that killed Alexander Hamilton. You likely know the name, Founding Father, the face on the $10 bill, George Washington's right-hand man during the Revolution. But it's easy to forget that Hamilton died not in office, nor from illness or war, but from a bullet fired by another statesman, Aaron Burr, the sitting Vice President of the United States. It sounds unbelievable now, But dueling in early 19th century America was a twisted ritual of honor, a public show with private rules, illegal in many places, but still widely practiced among political and military elites. Insults, no matter how minor, could escalate rapidly. To let a public slight go unanswered was to risk being seen as weak. Hamilton and Burr had circled each other for years. They were opposites in nearly every way. Hamilton, the immigrant from the Caribbean, self-made, brilliant, relentless. Burr, the aristocratic New Yorker, smooth, charming, and politically elusive. Hamilton built systems, banks, the Treasury, the Constitution itself. Burr maneuvered through them. Their political rivalry was bitter, but it was personal grievances that finally boiled over. In 1804, Burr ran for governor of New York. Hamilton, though no longer in office, used his influence to campaign against him, calling him untrustworthy and dangerous. Rumors swirled that Hamilton had said something even more scathing at a private dinner. Burr demanded an apology. Hamilton refused. He danced around specifics, offering principles, not contrition. And so, letters were exchanged, insults carefully preserved on parchment. Seconds were appointed. The date was set. And on that July morning, 2 boats slipped across the river to Weehawken. It was the same dueling ground where Hamilton's own son, Philip, had been shot and killed just 3 years earlier. Hamilton must have known the risk. But honor in those days overruled even grief. The details of the duel are clouded by conflicting reports. According to Hamilton's second, Nathaniel Pendleton, Hamilton never intended to fire at Burr. He planned to throw away his shot, aiming wide, making a symbolic gesture rather than a deadly one. But Burr's bullet found its mark. It struck Hamilton just above the right hip, tearing through his organs, lodging in his spine. Hamilton collapsed instantly. He was ferried back across the river, barely conscious, and taken to the home of a friend in Greenwich Village. His wife Eliza was summoned. For over 30 hours he lingered in agony. Doctors could do little. His breath grew shallow, his pulse weaker. On July 12, 1804, Alexander Hamilton died. He was 47 years old. The city of New York mourned loudly. His funeral procession filled the streets. Ministers praised his faith. Political enemies fell silent. But the man who shot him, Aaron Burr, slipped into shadow. Though he was not immediately prosecuted, Burr's career was over. He finished his term as vice president in disgrace. He would later be tried for treason on unrelated charges. He wandered through Europe. He returned to obscurity, but the duel never faded. And still today, people ask, why didn't Hamilton walk away? Why, after seeing his own son die on that same field, did he still accept the challenge? Was it pride, principle, despair? Or was it simply that, in a time when men carried pistols to prove points, walking away felt more dangerous than being shot? Alexander Hamilton lay dying in the second floor, bedroom of a friend's house at 82 Jane Street. The room was warm, the street below unusually quiet. His wife Eliza arrived with their children, summoned too late to stop the duel, just in time to witness its aftermath. He was in pain, though lucid. He requested communion. He spoke softly. He said goodbye. In his final hours, Hamilton asked for forgiveness, from his God, his family, and perhaps from himself. This wasn't just the death of a man, it was the death of a founding voice. And for many, it felt senseless, preventable, small. The duel had no legal standing, it solved no problem. It did not settle an argument, there was no victory, only loss. And Burr, he had won nothing. Despite surviving the duel, his reputation was shattered. Almost immediately, newspapers painted him as a murderer. Though dueling was illegal in New York and New Jersey, the laws were rarely enforced. Still, public opinion turned swiftly. Burr's political allies abandoned him. He finished his vice presidential term in silence, but Hamilton's death clung to him like smoke. Burr would later write that he felt justified in the duel, that Hamilton had attacked his honor, refused apology, and left him no choice. But the country disagreed. Hamilton's friends ensured his writings were published, his speeches reprinted, his character defended. The duel was a scandal, but it was also a national moment of reflection. Hamilton's funeral was enormous. Thousands turned out to walk behind the coffin. Orphans, whom Hamilton had long supported, led the procession. Ministers praised his Christian faith, though he had been denied communion at first due to his role in the duel. Eventually, a pastor relented. His deathbed request was honored. In life, Hamilton had been polarizing, brash, controlling, sometimes unforgiving. But in death, he became something else, a symbol of genius cut short. In the months that followed, Eliza began her life's quiet mission, to preserve and defend his legacy. She raised their children alone. She wore black the rest of her life. And she lived long, 50 years longer than her husband. She founded New York's first private orphanage. She collected Hamilton's letters. She defended his reputation through generations. She never remarried. She never forgot. And through her efforts, a man who died under suspicion of political overreach and personal arrogance became one of America's most complex founding figures. But the duel still lingers. Even now, historians debate what really happened on that bluff. Did Hamilton aim to miss? Did Burr intend to kill? Did either man hesitate? Or was it all over in one blink? A puff of smoke, a single crack of gunpowder, and the soft thud of a man collapsing on dew-wet grass. The pistols used were owned by Hamilton's brother-in-law. They were relics of Revolutionary War days, elegant, wooden-handled, with hidden hair triggers, something Burr may not have known. This small mechanical detail may have increased the chance of a lethal shot, but by then, it was too late for detail. By the time Eliza Hamilton laid her husband to rest at Trinity Church in Lower Manhattan, the city had already begun to shift. In the aftermath of the duel, something changed, not just in politics, but in how Americans thought about honor, argument, and what it meant to fight. Hamilton's grave sits quietly there still, not far from the financial institutions he helped create. A modest obelisk, weathered stone. The city he helped design roars around him. Skyscrapers, subways, traffic, stock, exchanges. But beneath that ground lies a man who once dreamed and dueled and fell. Aaron Burr lived on for another 32 years, but they were not kind years. He was charged with murder in both New York and New Jersey, though neither case went to trial. Still, he was shunned by polite society. His political allies turned away. His name became a quiet stain, his career a cautionary tale. In 1807, he was arrested and tried for treason, this time for plotting to raise a private army and create an independent empire in the western United States. The details remain murky. He was acquitted but never trusted again. He lived in relative obscurity, broke and increasingly alone. When he died in 1836, almost no one attended his funeral. He was buried without ceremony. Hamilton's reputation, by contrast, only grew. In his own time, he had been a divisive figure, a brilliant economist but accused of being monarchist in his sympathies, an abolitionist, yet complicit in systems that benefited from slavery, a builder of institutions, yet mistrusted by many of the very people he served. But after his death, Americans began to see him differently. He was the architect of the Treasury, the founder of the Coast Guard, the originator of modern banking in the United States. He wrote most of the Federalist Papers. He established principles that would guide future governments: strong federal authority, stable economic foundations, a nation guided by law. And he had done it all in less than 50 years. His life, cut short on a quiet bluff in New Jersey, became an example of brilliance extinguished by pettiness. He had survived war, revolution, and political infighting, but not pride. The duel, at first a scandal, became a symbol, not of valor, but of the cost of ego, of the weight of unsaid words, of what happens when the smartest man in the room still makes the most avoidable mistake. Over time, dueling faded from American life. Public opinion turned. Courts began to enforce anti-dueling laws. The very concept began to feel archaic. Not gallant, just grim. And perhaps Hamilton's death helped tip that balance, because it made people ask, what if? What if he had walked away? What if the letter had been worded more carefully? What if the ritual of insult and response had been broken just once? Would Hamilton have lived to become president? Would Burr have remained a national figure instead? Of a footnote, would America's early years have been more stable, more just, more Human, we'll never know. But here is what we do know. Alexander Hamilton's story is still being told. In books, in classrooms, on stages, in financial systems. In the rhythm of American language, he is remembered not just for what he wrote or built, but for what he lost, and how he lost it. The duel shouldn't have happened, but it did. And in that single irreversible moment, a man fell, a nation paused, and history learned, however slowly, to stop settling arguments with smoke and powder. And maybe, just maybe, it finally started asking, what is honor mate without violence? It sounds like fiction, like something out of a twisted fairy tale or dark comedy. A person tied down, not beaten or burned or stabbed, but tickled, slowly, methodically, until breath gave out, until nerves collapsed. Until the body could no longer endure joy turned cruel. But it's not entirely fiction. Throughout history, quietly and rarely, tickling has been used as a form of punishment, not in the theatrical sense you might imagine, with feathers and giggles, but in something much more controlled, more clinical, and far more disturbing. The earliest documented accounts come from ancient China and imperial Rome. These weren't widespread practices. They weren't used on battlefields or public squares. They were private, strategic, reserved for nobles, traitors, or those whose bloodlines were too important to spill. In Rome, during the reign of Tiberius, it is said that certain prisoners were subjected to a punishment known as phalanga, or variations of it, where the soles of the feet were beaten or stimulated as a form of torture. But in more delicate cases, where injury or death was not desired, tickling became an alternative. One method involved tying the victim down, often in a prone or seated position, and dipping their feet in salt water or brine. Then a goat was brought in. The goat, attracted to the salt, would begin licking the soles of the victim's feet. Slowly, repeatedly, over and over again. It began with laughter, uncontrollable. Then came spasms, then panic, then exhaustion. The nerves of the foot, among the most sensitive in the body, would begin to fire uncontrollably. The muscles would seize, the breath would grow shallow, and in some extreme reports, if left long enough, the person would lose consciousness or worse. Historians debate whether these punishments ever led directly to death. Medical science suggests that while tickling may not kill in the immediate sense, prolonged exposure to intense, inescapable stimulation can lead to cardiac stress, suffocation, or even seizure in vulnerable individuals, especially if combined with dehydration, humiliation, or restricted movement. In some cases, victims were denied sleep. The tickling would resume every time they began to doze off. In others, multiple parts of the body were targeted: armpits, ribs, neck, thighs, each pushed to the brink. But the strange horror of tickling as torture is not just physical. It's psychological. Tickling bypasses the rational brain. It provokes laughter even when we are not amused. It overwhelms the body with contradiction, joy and panic, stimulation and helplessness. When done consensually, it's a game. When forced, it becomes something else entirely. In medieval Germany, tickling reportedly appeared in the punishment books of certain city-states. In one particularly grim account, a merchant accused of fraud was bound in the town square and subjected to hours of public tickling by children as a form of humiliation. He was not physically injured, but afterward he withdrew entirely from society. He never spoke publicly again. The punishment wasn't fatal, but it was complete. In the 18th century, some prisons experimented with sensory torment, not pain, but stimulation. Cold water dripped rhythmically on the forehead. Soft brushes were run repeatedly across the same patch of skin. The body, denied rest or escape, began to break down. Some prisoners hallucinated, others wept uncontrollably. Still others refused food, spoke in nonsense, or simply stopped responding. It was not that they had been tortured in the traditional sense. It was that their sense of control had been dismantled, and tickling, gentle, absurd, harmless seeming, was one of the tools. Why would people resort to this? Because it left no scars, no wounds, no bruises. No blood, only memory, and that was sometimes worse. Tickling was used not to maim the body, but to unseat the mind, to punish not with pain, but with helplessness, to humiliate, to overwhelm, to remind the prisoner, gently and unforgettably, that even laughter could become a weapon. But the question remains, could someone truly be tickled to death? In modern medicine, tickling is usually studied in childhood psychology or laughter response research, but it has also raised more serious questions, especially in cases of extreme, prolonged exposure. The human body is built to tolerate a range of stimuli, pressure, vibration, even sharp pain. But tickling, especially when it's involuntary, activates a different kind of nerve loop. It engages the hypothalamus, the same region of the brain that governs fight or flight responses, and it does so without a clear external threat. That's what makes it so disturbing. The laughter triggered by tickling is not genuine amusement. It's a neurological reflex, similar to a sneeze or a flinch. And when it continues without reprieve, the body begins to panic. Breathing becomes erratic. Muscles tighten, heart rate increases. In rare cases, this cascade can lead to hyperventilation, fainting, or cardiac arrest, especially in people with underlying conditions. One modern case occurred in 1897 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. A young man, reportedly a servant in the household of a minor noble family, died after being held down and tickled by several drunken guests. The report, filed in Vienna, was vague. No autopsy, no public scandal. But the cause of death listed was asphyxiation brought on by extreme nervous excitement. The phrase is clinical, but what it describes is chaos inside the body. adrenaline flooding the system, lungs unable to coordinate with the diaphragm, the brain losing track of how to pace each breath. He may have laughed the entire way down. Stories like this are rare, but not entirely isolated. In the 20th century, scattered forensic reports and newspaper oddities reference death by laughter, especially in cases where people with weak hearts suffered cardiac arrest during moments of uncontrollable mirth, jokes, pranks, or yes, tickling. These are not urban legends. They're rare but documented, and historically the line between tickling and torture was not always clear. In ancient Japan, during certain shogunates, there existed a punishment called kusuguri zeme, loosely translated as merciless tickling. It was often used on disgraced courtiers or debtors, carried out in private by officials or even trained entertainers. The goal was not death, but confession, exhaustion, submission. Victims were tied to tatami mats, tickled on the feet, and sides with delicate tools, long feathers, fine brushes, or in some cases the trimmed claws of animals. This would go on for hours. No physical damage, no visible abuse, just the steady erosion of will. Survivors reported hallucinations. Some reported temporary paralysis, others long-term trauma. It was efficient. It was deniable. It left nothing behind but silence. What makes this form of punishment so peculiar and so haunting is the confusion it creates in the mind of the victim. Most traditional torture inflicts pain, but tickling mimics joy. The body responds with laughter, even as the mind panics. That's what makes it so effective and so cruel. In the modern world, where laws forbid corporal punishment in most nations, tickling has reappeared, strangely, in the fringes of fetish culture, performance art, and psychological studies. But the darker historical use is largely forgotten, and perhaps that's intentional, because the idea that something so harmless seeming could be used to dominate, to extract, to break, is deeply unsettling. And yet, it's real. Tickling, in its most innocent form, is play. Between siblings, parents and children, friends. But as history shows, when stripped of choice, it becomes something else. A slow dismantling of autonomy, a test of how long a person can laugh before they stop breathing. And that leaves us with one chilling question. If a punishment leaves no scars, was it ever really seen? Tickling someone to death doesn't sound real. It sounds like folklore, a bizarre punchline or a twisted fairy tale punishment for a jester who went too far. And in many ways, that's what it became. A story murmured across centuries, too absurd to accept, too uncomfortable to forget. But the absence of proof is not the same as proof of absence. There are no monuments to tickling victims, no official archives in grand museums, no detailed state records. The method left nothing behind, no wounds, no blood, no damage to display. Only the stories and the silence that followed. And in history, silence has always been easy to ignore. It's no coincidence that this form of torture fell out of use precisely because it was invisible, in an age where power wanted to be seen, where executions were public and pain was theatrical. Tickling was too quiet, too private, too ambiguous. It didn't satisfy the crowd. It didn't warn others with screams or blood, and yet it may have been more effective than anyone realized. Its psychological impact is hard to quantify. Some victims of prolonged tickling describe it not as a physical sensation, but as a kind of disintegration, say a feeling of being unmade, of the body no longer belonging to itself, of laughter becoming terror, then shame. That's perhaps the darkest part of this history. Not that people died from it, but that they lived afterward, changed, with no proof of what had been done to them. It raises uncomfortable questions. How do we define violence? Is it only what bruises, only what bleeds? Or can it be something soft, something absurd, something that uses joy like a mask? In the centuries since, stories of tickled torture have migrated from legal documents to legends, from punishment to taboo. They show up in obscure books, in whispers, in old court chronicles translated and retranslated until the horror becomes humor, the memory distorted. But every so often a report surfaces, a trial transcript, a witness statement, a marginal note in the journal of a traveling monk. And there it is again, a person tied down, a feather in someone's hand, and a silence at the end that feels heavier than laughter should allow. Modern forensic experts will say tickling cannot kill, at least not directly, that it might cause fainting, panic, collapse. But death? Unlikely. And perhaps that's true. But history isn't always about what's medically possible. It's about what people believed could happen, about what they feared, about how power was expressed, and how the body could be controlled without leaving a single mark. Tickling in this rare and disturbing form became one of the strangest tools in the archive of human punishment. Not because it was common, but because it was quiet, because it confused pleasure with panic, because it used something innocent to do something unforgettable, and because even now, long after it disappeared, it still makes us wonder, what else has history buried, not because it was unbelievable, but because it was simply too soft to leave a scar? On the morning of February 17, 1600, a man was led barefoot through the cold streets of Rome. His tongue was clamped to prevent him from speaking. He had been in a cell for nearly 8 years. When he emerged into the daylight, he blinked, not at the sun, but at the scaffold. He was Giordano Bruno, a philosopher, a former Dominican friar, and in the eyes of the Roman Inquisition, a dangerous heretic. The sentence was death by fire. He was to be burned alive in the Campo de' Fiori, a public square that sold vegetables by day and spectacle by decree. The crowd gathered. The authorities read his sentence aloud. Bruno said nothing, because he physically could not. His silence, however, was not consent. What had he done? He had spoken of stars, and he had dared to say that they had no end. Giordano Bruno was born in 1548 in Nola, a small town near Naples. He joined the Dominican order as a teenager, drawn to the intellectual freedom of the monastery, but almost from the beginning, he struggled with boundaries, of doctrine, of hierarchy, of imagination. While the Church taught that the cosmos was orderly, finite, and designed to reflect divine harmony, Bruno saw something else. Reading ancient texts, he became obsessed with the idea that the universe was infinite, that stars were not just lights fixed in the sky, but distant suns, each possibly with their own worlds, their own creatures, their own versions of life. To say this in the late 16th century was more than scientific speculation. It was theological rebellion, because if Earth was not the center, if the cosmos had no edge, if there were other worlds, then what did that mean for the soul, for Christ, for salvation? Bruno didn't stop there. He questioned the virgin birth, the Trinity, the notion of eternal damnation. He suggested that God was not a ruler who sat above creation, but a presence that flowed through all things, not distant, but immanent. These weren't passing thoughts. They were arguments repeated across books, lectures, and debates. He was not careful. He was not diplomatic. He was not quiet. He fled Italy in 1576, long before the Church could react. He wandered through Switzerland, France, England, and Germany, writing, teaching, offending. He debated scholars in Oxford. He published philosophical dialogues. He compared Copernicus to Moses and suggested that the heliocentric model of the solar system was not just correct, but too small. Even Copernicus, Bruno said, had underestimated the vastness of the cosmos. For this, some called him a visionary, others a madman. Giordano Bruno's execution was not quick. Burning, even when the fire is hot, is a method of death that takes time. And for the Church, that was the point. It was not just punishment. It was theater. Doctrine made visible. A warning carved in smoke. And yet, the flames that consumed Bruno's body could not burn the questions he left behind. What if the universe was infinite? What if we were not at the center? What if there were other worlds with other beings also asking questions? For years after his death, the Church hoped Bruno would be forgotten. Unlike Galileo, he had no telescope. Unlike Newton, no formula. He had no hard science behind his claims, just speculation and passion. He wasn't a heretic in the way of data. He was a heretic in the way of wonder, and so his name faded for a time. But ideas, once released, move slowly through history, like sparks on the wind. In the centuries that followed, Bruno's vision began to reappear, not in pulpits, but in laboratories. As astronomy advanced, so did the universe. In the 17th century, Galileo confirmed the motion of planets. In the 18th, Herschel discovered Uranus. In the 19th, spectrography revealed that stars were made of the same elements as Earth. And in the 20th, Edwin Hubble proved that galaxies exist beyond our own. Bruno had been right, not in the details, but in the scale. He had imagined a universe so vast that no center could hold it. A cosmos not designed to flatter humanity, but to humble it. It took 400 years for the world to catch up. Today, Bruno's statue stands in the very square where he was burned, Campo dei Fiori, Rome. It faces the Vatican, hooded, dark, stern. Erected in 1889 by Italian freethinkers and scholars, it's a tribute not to Bruno the scientist, but to Bruno the thinker, the one who refused to recant. The plaque reads simply, "To Giordano Bruno, from the century he foretold, here, where the fire burned." But even that tribute is complicated, because Bruno's story is often misremembered, as a martyr for science, as a lone rebel against tyranny, as a man ahead of his time. And while there is truth in all of that, it overlooks who he really was, a mystic, a mathematician, a man who saw the stars not just as objects but as signs. His universe was not a cold one, governed by gravity and void, but a living, breathing infinite, alive with divine possibility. He believed the soul was eternal. He believed that memory was a sacred art. He believed that light itself was the language of the divine, and that's why he was feared, not because he challenged the church's astronomy, but because he challenged its authority to define reality at all. He wrote, "The divine is not outside us, it is within. It burns in all things. It is the infinite made flesh in motion." That's the kind of sentence that terrifies institutions, and so they burned him. But what they could never quite kill was the question, if the universe is endless, then what else have we been wrong about? By the standards of his day, Giordano Bruno was doomed from the moment he began to speak too clearly about the stars, not because he was a revolutionary, not because he was correct, but because he refused to accept limits. Bruno did not simply propose ideas, he insisted on them. He wrote not with caution but with insistence. His words were sharp, often arrogant. He challenged not only the church's view of the universe, but its right to determine what people could imagine. That, more than any single sentence in his books, was what sealed his fate. When institutions feel threatened, they rarely react to ideas. They react to disobedience, and Bruno would not obey. But it's important to remember that Bruno was not universally admired. Many scholars, even some modern ones, viewed him as reckless, as a man who stretched metaphor into doctrine, who blurred philosophy and science until neither could breathe. He was not a comfortable figure. But then, history rarely preserves the comfortable ones. His works were not easy to read. His ideas about an infinite universe were tangled in mysticism and ancient hermeticism. He quoted from Egyptian magic texts. He believed the soul could ascend into the cosmos through mental discipline. He was not Galileo. He wasn't interested in proving the heliocentric model with data. He wanted to rewrite the very concept of the cosmos. To Bruno, the universe wasn't just big, it was sacred, and endless, and alive. And in this belief he was profoundly modern, because today our telescopes confirm what his vision only guessed, that the universe is not a neat concentric sphere, but a web of galaxies stretching beyond comprehension. That stars are born and die like seeds in a windstorm, that Earth is not central, that humanity is not the axis. And yet even now, we often behave as if it were. Bruno's life reminds